Welcome to today's webinar featuring a cybersecurity threat briefing for local government leaders. I'm Mark Levine, and I'm the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties. Thank you for joining us this morning's threat briefing from our team of experts who respond after a cyber breach happens. Hailing from U.S. government agencies, law enforcement, and global security firms, Unit 42 security consultants have handled some of the largest data breaches in history. This strategic threat briefing will deliver a view of the threat landscape by a Unit 42 analyst with access to a depth and breadth of data across all connected platforms and services. Today's program is co-sponsored by NYSAC, the New York Conference of Mayors, the Association of Towns, the New York Municipal Insurance Reciprocal, and the Center for Technology and Government at the University at Albany. All of us have been working together over these past 2 years to create and deliver cybersecurity resources for non-technical local government leaders. This webinar series is the 10th. This webinar is the 10th of a series of webinars that we have been co-sponsoring to help educate our non-technical local leaders about the issues that are important to them as they look at their cybersecurity posture. The cybersecurity webinars are available on our website. The recordings of those webinars are available on the NYSAC website at nysac.org/cyber. We also have the other resources that we have created and delivered for you. So please take some time and peruse that website at your leisure. We have a few brief housekeeping announcements before we begin. Jeanette Stanziano, the NYSAC Director of Education and Training, will make those housekeeping remarks. Jeanette.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. Just a couple of key issues before we begin. As Mark mentioned, we are recording this session as we do with all of our webinars, and you can find it on our website under webinars. You can also find it on YouTube under NYSAC TV under webinars. Just look for today's date. Also, we want to encourage you to submit questions at any point throughout the webinar. The way that we ask you to submit them is through your dashboard under the questions tab. Just click on the questions tab and type in your question, and we'll get to all questions at the end of the program during our Q&A session. Back to you, Mark.
The daily mission of Unit 42 is to protect the digital world from cyber attacks. Unit 42 wakes up every day focused on collecting and analyzing the most up-to-date threat intelligence and applying their analysis to respond to cyber attacks. John Wood, our speaker today, is the Consulting Director for Unit 42. He has over 2 decades of experience in the cybersecurity space, including 24 years with the FBI, conducting full-time computer forensic examinations in support of all field office violations, and he conducts incident response and intrusion investigation. Thank you for joining us today, John, and we appreciate your time, expertise, and advice for our local leaders.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate the intro. So just a little bit about myself. Like you said, I've been with the FBI. I was with the FBI for 24 years, almost 24 years, retired about 4 years ago. I was very fortunate. I got to work a lot of very high profile cases. The Edward Snowden case was my case. Ardit Farizi. I worked on the General Petraeus case, worked on a lot of APT engagements, Chinese, Iranian, Russian, and North Korean. I've done incident response in both houses of Congress, the State Department, and other places within the U.S. government. When I retired 4 years ago, I went into the private sector and have been working ever since then in incident response. Currently, I'm a Director of Incident Response in Unit 42 with Palo Alto Networks. So I'm going to give you a kind of an overall of what's going out there in the world, what's going on. And please, if you have any questions, go ahead and get them into the chat as soon as you have them, so you don't forget. And I'll try to address them, as it makes sense, either during the presentation or after. So what the attackers are going for. My unit, we have about a dozen directors or so and about 200 incident responders around the world. So we work about 1,400 or so engagements every year, which means we see a lot. We see kind of a microcosm of everything that's going on around the world. And we can pattern things. We can see what attackers are doing. We have an understanding of really the world of cybercrime. What we're seeing in 22 and previous years have been very similar to this as well. The two big boys, of course, in cybercrime are ransomware and business email compromise. It's kind of been this way for several years. You look at this and this is 70% of all the crime. And then, we see a little sprinkling of, a few other things, some insider cases and some PCI investigations, some accidental exposures. But for the most part, these are the two big boys. So I'm going to cover them a little bit today, focusing more so on ransomware and touching a little bit on BECs. So this is what we would call an attack chain or a kill chain. And it's very generic, but when we talk about hacking is not magic. It's not some guy typing feverishly at a keyboard and then all of a sudden, eureka, it happens and he gets in and he's hacked, right? It's not really what it's all about. Hacking is a step-by-step process. You do A and then you do B and then you do C, and this doesn't change. It's just like if you're producing something. Let's say you're creating a chemical reaction at a chemical plant, right? You add this to this and then you add this and that creates your final product, right? Similar in hacking. So one of the first things that we see is initial access into the environment, and it can be a lot of different ways, right? It could be a phishing's still pretty active. We sometimes see credentials that have been reused, that have been found on the dark web, and people, we're all kind of creatures of habit, and we tend to use our same passwords because we remember them easier. But that creates a bit of a vulnerability, because if your credentials were stolen as a let's say you were part of the Marriott intrusion and all of that information was taken. Well, they're going to find your credentials, and then they could use those in other ways. Maybe in your in other areas where you use that same password. So we see that every once in a while as well. And then really the big boy recently, I would say since about maybe late 2019, has been exploits, and we'll go into a little bit more depth on that down the road. And then we see, once the attacker gets initial access, he's going to first establish some type of persistence into the environment, just in case he gets kicked out or anything happens. He's going to have this tool, a backdoor, where he can come back into the environment, right? And that's establishing what we call a C2 connection, right? A command and control backdoor. Then he's going to start doing reconnaissance and credential theft activity, right? He's going to start using tools like Mimikatz, Lasagna, ProcDump, things like that can dump plain text passwords. This is what we call living off the land. When they get into an environment and they can use and they use malware. Well, malware is very noisy, and all of your endpoint defenses usually will stop different kinds of malware. But if you're able to compromise credentials, nobody's going to know if you're using RDP, remote desktop protocol, to laterally move around the environment using legitimate credentials. So that's what they want to do, is they want to be that needle in a stack of needles. They want to be hiding in plain sight, so to speak. So they'll try to steal preferably domain admin credentials and use those to laterally move and kind of start their reconnaissance activity. They want to figure out, what is your crown jewels? What do you have? What can they steal that they can use to leverage against you, to pressure you to paying them? And then once they've laterally moved, they've found the file servers, and they've stolen and exfiltrated all of this data, then they'll roll into actually deploying the ransomware. The reason we talk about Cobalt Strike particularly on this slide is because Cobalt Strike is a push exploitation tool that's used in, I don't know, 80% of all attacks nowadays. And it's a very common, what you might call in lead terms as a backdoor. So we've seen a recent trend, let's say 4.5, 5 years ago when ransomware started getting, popular. It was pretty easy for a company to just, get attacked, and, companies were not very good at keeping backups, or they were keeping backups on the network, and threat actors were encrypting those. So threat actors were very successful in the early days of this. So that's all they needed, and they were able to get paid. Well, I think they started seeing a downturn in their revenues because companies started seeing, okay, well, ransomware, how do we really stop the impact of that? Well, we have good backups, and we have immutable backups, or we have offline backups or cold storage backups. And so companies started getting better at recovering from ransomware without having to pay. And we saw that the threat actors were being less and less successful. So they started probably maybe 2.5 years ago with REvil, and they started experimenting. They said, okay, we're going to start stealing data, and then we're going to use that to extort against you, because you can't rebuild to mitigate that. You can't fix that. We've stolen it already. And once they were successful with it, pretty much everybody started doing the exact same thing. And we've actually even rolled into groups that just steal data and don't do any encryption and attempt to extort against you, groups like Karakurt. And then as that starts to get a little less, maybe a company has old data that you stole, but it really doesn't have any value, right? Well, they started ramping up the pressure, additionally. They started doing some DDoS attacks, to shut down your web presence. We see them also harassing, customers, partners, business contacts, employees, your board member, your CEO, making calls to them saying, hey, we have your data, and your company doesn't want to pay for this, tell them to pay and protect your data. So we started seeing this as well. The goal in the end is to get you to pay. So anything they can do to pressure you, they're going to do. Excuse me. So the next trend that we were talking about early on is the business email compromise. And there are so many variations of theme to this type of attack. But in the end, this is a lesser sophisticated attacker than ransomware. They're not really hacking much. This is really more of a social engineering type of attack with a little bit of technical expertise injected. We see the predominant majority of these coming out of Nigeria, kind of the variation of the old Nigerian attacks that the Nigerian fraud or the Nigerian emails that we used to see for all those years. They've kind of moved into this, and it really can be any type of attack and any way to attempt to monetize their access. We have seen, 99% of the time, this is initiated with a phish. And it's gotten a little bit more sophisticated over the years, but in the end, it's getting access to an email box and then trying to find a way to redirect any funds. If they can get onto an email box with, let's say, a person that works in finance and does wire transfers. We saw this, my last couple of years with the FBI, we started seeing this very heavy with title companies, because title companies are handling lots of transfers of money, ACH transfers, wire transfers, for large real estate transactions. So they were one of the early on targets, right? And what the goal is to, get in the middle of a conversation. They will create an inbox rule that hides that conversation from the legitimate user, so he doesn't go, hey, I didn't send this, what's going on here? So typically they'll create an inbox rule that sends emails of whatever thread the threat actor has injected himself into, to like the RSS feeds folder or something like that, where it can't be seen or won't be seen most likely by the legitimate user. And then he will engage with whoever that person is, and that outside person, and say, I need to. Our company has changed our wiring instructions. We changed our bank, something to that effect, and we need you to send whatever these funds are involved to this bank account because this is new for us. And then the person would say, okay, no problem, and then they start redirecting money over to this additional one, and then the threat actors would start ATMing money like crazy out and just withdrawing as much cash as they can from that account. So that's the basic theme of this, but we've also seen a lot of other variations. Like we have seen actually, before I left the FBI, I traveled to Nigeria on a case where we identified threat actors that were actually just sending one-off emails. They weren't even really getting into the email account. They were sending one-off emails using, an I instead of an L in the domain, and it looks the same when you first look at it, but it is definitely different. Registering those domains, creating an email, and then making it look like you are the CEO, sending something to your secretary saying, hey, I'm in a meeting, it's very important. I need all of the W-2s for the entire company sent to me, and I need this stat, right? So that's one of the things that they do, is they always want to make it look like an emergency so that people bypass the policies or the procedures for protecting data. The secretary doesn't want to upset her boss, or so she goes, gathers that information and emails back to him. Well, she's unwittingly sending that to the threat actor. Once the threat actor gets it, they were actually filing false tax returns and getting those the return amounts sent back to their own account. And in my particular case, it was a fraud of about $30 million. So it was a pretty significant amount of money. But any way that they can use their access to either entrench themselves further or to monetize is what they want to do. We've even seen where a threat actor gets into a mailbox that really has no monetary value to it, but he'll use that as a launching pad to send additional emails or additional spam or phishes to people inside the organization, or even people outside the organization. Because if you're sending things from legitimate emails, I mean, it is a legitimate email. It's a legitimate email address. When you hover on it, it comes from the right place. So it gives it a little bit more legitimacy. So sometimes we'll see that in an attempt to get additional victims. So I want to talk quickly about some threat and ransom groups, and I've picked out a few that are just relatively unique in certain ways. We have, I don't know, we've identified 200 plus different groups. So it's not like this is an accumulation of them all. It is just a few groups of note that I want to highlight. So Lazarus is unique because Lazarus is a state-backed but monetarily run organization. So Lazarus is North Korean, and as we all know, North Korea has been under sanctions for many years. So they need money. So this particular group here, their goal is to make money for the regime, right? And we've seen them involved in lots of different attacks. And as a matter of fact, just this morning I saw another attack that they were involved in, where they're starting to phish people who are involved in cryptocurrency and trying to steal their cryptocurrency. We have seen them targeting global financial institutions and exfiltrating out hundreds of millions of dollars. We have seen them actually attempt ransomware. We have seen them hacking cryptocurrency exchanges and transferring out hundreds of millions worth of cryptocurrency. Anything they can do to actually steal money. So this is a unique group. We don't see too many of these where it's state sponsored, but also monetarily involved. So Lapsus, this is a group that is a little bit near and dear to my heart. I've worked a number of engagements against this group. And they're not really a strong hacking group. They're really a good social engineering. They're very good at social engineering, very adept at it. And they're not really monetarily motivated. This group really kind of reminds me of the things going on back in, around 2000 or so, when, the early days of the internet, when, kids were hacking, defacing websites, and, they were doing it all to get attention, and to get bona fides, and, hey, look what I did, I'm so cool, and so forth. That's almost what this group does. Anytime they hack anything, they take their information directly to Telegram and tell all their followers, this is what I did, and this is the data that I stole. And they're responsible for a lot of accesses to a bunch of high-profile companies. You're talking about Microsoft, Okta, Uber, a lot of companies here, Vodafone, that they've been involved in big hacks, and primarily through social engineering. This is an actual attack that I handled that was very interesting, but it does show that, you can have great defenses, but, if you have one little chink in your armor, these guys can exploit that. This was a company in the Middle East, and they had a very good security program. They were very strong security-wise, but they just had that one little problem. So the initial threat vector we found was, we couldn't find, where they got initial access, and then we started doing some research on the internet, and we found the exact credentials that the threat actor was using. So we believe that they used those credentials. Again, we talked about that in the beginning of the presentation, that threat actors will oftentimes do this. So when the threat actor logged into the environment, they required two-factor authentication to get to anything significant within the environment, anything that had any importance or any value. So, we could see him floundering around trying to get access to things, but he really couldn't. So first thing he tried was what we call an MFA bomb, or a fatigue attack, what they call officially a fatigue attack, where they will send MFA or two-factor authentication requests to the legitimate user multiple times, just spamming it. And then it wears them down, and then if the person finally says yes, okay, go ahead, yeah, approve. This didn't work. They tried to do it, but it didn't work. The legitimate user just turned off his phone and said, I'm not going to deal with this. Fortunately for them. So the next morning, we saw him open a ticket with their support, with their help desk, and said, hey, I was at a concert last night. I lost my phone. I got a new phone this morning, and I need to set up a new two-factor authentication. So the help desk guy says, okay, no problem. I just need to verify your identity. And he says, what is your date of birth? So he gives him his date of birth, October 3rd or something like that. And he says, okay, let's get you set up. Well, that's very weak, because as we all know that, in any type of, data dumps or compromise of identities, a date of birth is almost always involved. So date of births are not a very good way to to verify identity. It should be something that is not written down somewhere. It should be something that's in your brain, in your mind. Something like, who was your first grade teacher? Who was your favorite pet? Who was your first pet? Things like that. Stuff that is not going to be written down or documented somewhere and can be stolen. So that was where their chink in their armor was. So he got into the environment, and then of course, all heck broke loose, and he, caused a lot of damage and deleted their entire Azure environment, causing this client to be down for multiple weeks. So this is an example where a threat actor is not necessarily sophisticated, but it can definitely cause a lot of damage. So this is Lockbit 2.0, sorry, Lockbit 3.0. I'm not sure where the 2.0, 3.0 thing came from, but maybe they patched themselves, or I don't know what they did. They upgraded themselves or something. This is an interesting group because it's kind of turned into one of the big boys. A few years ago, it wasn't as big, but it has gained significant traction, and in the last year, they have taken over as, since Conti broke up, they have taken over as the big boy on the block. One of the interesting things about this group is they actually started a bug bounty program. So a lot of companies will have a bug bounty program that if, they'll pay you a certain amount of money if you find some bug in their software or some vulnerability or something like that. Well, this group has done that, and they've apparently actually paid somebody for finding a bug in their software. So I thought that was interesting. But keep in mind these groups, these in this ransomware as a service model, these groups all run themselves like an organization, like a business. So it kind of makes sense a little bit. This group is Alpha V, or Black Cat, what we call them. And Alpha V is an interesting group. They're not very old. They're only about a year and some change old. The way they set themselves apart is when they started in the ransomware as a service model, each kind of subcontractor, so to speak, you have the main creators of the malware, and they will hire people to do the different jobs, right? They start with the hackers, and they will make an agreement with the hackers. Okay, you get X% of the total amount that we recover from this victim, whoever you hack, and then the negotiators will get a piece of that, and then the money launderers will get a piece of that, and everybody gets a little percentage. Well, this group ramped up their percentages, and they started offering 80% of the payments going to the hackers. So what they started doing is actually attracting all of the better hackers because they're getting paid more. So they started kind of stealing all the hackers from some of the other groups. And this is really why they have progressed so far in only a year. And this is one of the groups also that is deploying, the triple extortion, the DDoS and the aggressive pressure tactics. So we oftentimes get asked about threat actor negotiations. So I wanted to put a couple of slides in here because I think people have an interest in what these are really all about. And this is one of the services, of course, that 42 does. We have about 10 or so negotiators that will negotiate on behalf of our clients for whatever those goals are. Speaking of goals, it's important to understand that negotiations don't necessarily mean, hey, we just want to try to get the dollar amount of the payment down to whatever we can legitimately stomach or pay. There can be a lot of different reasons for negotiating with a threat actor. One could be that maybe your organization doesn't have backups, and we need to actually get a decryptor to decrypt that information in order to stay in business. Or it could be that the information is so sensitive that we cannot, no matter what, we cannot allow that. For instance, law firms sometimes get hit, and that's a lot of sensitive court filings and so forth that can be stolen, and that information has more value, just to protect it than the actual value of the data. So sometimes that could be the case. But there are other reasons too. When we're conducting an investigation, the information that we gain or we glean from negotiations with these threat actors can be very helpful and informative to the investigation. One of the things in particular with exfiltration of data, it's very difficult to prove forensically because there's no real artifact that says they took this out of the environment. We can see things like jump lists, and link files and shell bags and things that show folder access or file access, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they exfiltrated that data out of the environment. So it can be very helpful because in a negotiation, it's not all that different from a negotiation, with say law enforcement and a kidnapper or a business negotiation, right? There's kind of a give and take, you prove to us that you have this data. And that's one of the things that we first require of them, where we tell them, okay, well, one, you have to prove that your decryptor actually works. So we're going to provide you some files and you decrypt them and let us know, we'll verify that these decrypted properly. So they have to do that usually. Then the second thing is we provide, or we require them to provide us a file tree, which is just a directory listing of all the files they took. Well, that's super important intelligence because it's very difficult, like I said, to determine what they actually took. So if we can get a file listing, we can do a much more accurate risk assessment and damage assessment of what this data is that they took. Instead of them just saying, hey, we took all your data, now we actually know exactly what data they took. Not only that, it also provides us intelligence on the systems they were on, because we know where most of the time people are going to know where this data came from. It's their environment, it's their data. So we can start looking and start working on the forensics from those points. It gives us investigative points. So it's very informative for the investigation. Another reason might be, when those attacks, the DDoS attacks, the aggressive tactics in calling, partners and all of that is meant really to bring you to the negotiation table, and that can, if you initiate a negotiation with them, that usually stops those types of aggressive tactics. It also can buy you time. If you need time to do your investigation, it can buy you time to start, conducting your investigation without these attacks going on, without concern that the threat actor is, still in the environment. You can buy yourself time to start your investigation and then start rebuilding your environment and rebuilding your defenses without, worrying about the threat actor, continuing the attacks. If they're engaged in negotiations, we can usually stall them out quite a bit during this time period to buy ourselves time. So I want to talk a little bit about attack surface. We see lots of different types of access, but I'm going to go over some of the more prevalent attacks that we see. So years ago, phishing was probably number one. We saw lots of phishing. Why? Because it works, right? And we still see it quite a bit. But we started seeing some changes probably in 2019, like I said, where we started seeing a shift into software vulnerabilities. I think with the NetScaler attack, the NetScaler's attack in late 2019 is kind of where I saw this trend starting. And we started seeing massive attacks to, tons of systems that were vulnerable, but the company still had not produced a patch or, created any remediation for these vulnerabilities. So threat actors started taking advantage of that, creating scanners. Log4j was another one. Threat actors within hours of the vulnerability announcement were already creating scanners to attempt to find and exploit these types of vulnerabilities. And it literally happens usually within hours after something like this occurs, because they know they have a window between the time that they are able to exploit it and the time that a patch comes out. So there's really not a whole lot that a company can do other than bring systems offline. When COVID started, we started seeing a lot of brute force attacks. Companies were going remote, workers were at home. And there was, IT was hastily setting up RDP servers that, were not really set up with security in mind. They weren't behind firewall or required VPN or two-factor or anything like that. It was just straight up, log in using your credentials. And we saw threat actors starting to do brute force credential attacks for those types of, RDP servers. We probably worked a year or more on those types of attacks constantly. So here you can see this is a number of different attacks that we see and have been very common. As you can see, the Microsoft Exchange attacks. This one, a couple of these are related to proxy shell, which was, we probably worked, 14 or 15 months on these type of attacks because companies were not patching their on-prem exchange. Citrix, the 2019 11634 is the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability, and actually Citrix has a current vulnerability that is starting to be exploited by APT5. We just found out in the last few days. The Pulse Secure VPN is another very common one. Fortinet firewalls were being exploited a long time. APT35, an Iranian group, likes to exploit Fortinet VPN and firewalls. Let's see, what are other ones? Atlassian, this was the on-prem exchange. I'm sorry, not exchange, on-prem Confluence vulnerability that was being exploited, and we're still seeing those coming through. And then Zoho Corp, this is the managed self-service engine that we've seen a number of APT organizations, primarily Chinese groups, exploiting this as well. Even to this day, we still see these. So we all know about security. If you're in security, you know that, we talk about this concept of layered security. We talk about defense in depth, and that has never changed. It's a good concept. Even physical security, you're talking about layers, right? It's not that much different in cybersecurity. If you own a jewelry store, are you just going to lock your doors? No, because then they'll kick the door in, right? Okay, well, then you set up security for your doors. You put bars on it or whatever. Well, then they come in through the windows. Okay, so we got to set up security for our windows. We're going to put bars and we're going to alarm the door. Okay, but what about if they just come in and crush it with a truck, break the wall down, smash and grab? Well, then, okay, so you're going to create an extra room that's going to be locked and alarmed, that's going to have a safe in it, and you're going to put everything in your safe, right? So you have multiple layers of security to deal with different attacks. There is no one-stop shop or one panacea security feature that can stop all attacks, right? It has to be a layered security type. But we do see these attacks being utilized in a lot of our intrusions that we investigate. And these are oftentimes very common to a lot of these attacks. Multi-factor authentication. This is oftentimes being used or refers to the BEC cases, because there are ways around multi-factor authentication to get into Microsoft M365, but probably 90% of the threat actors don't know how to do that. There are some more sophisticated threat actors that know how to do it, and it can be done, but you have already taken out of the equation 90% of those threat actors by just installing and using multi-factor authentication into your M365. Lack of endpoint protection is another one that's super important. When you can't see or you don't have visibility as to what's going on, how do you know what's going on those endpoints? So if you have no visibility, threat actors can run any tools they want. They can cultivate credentials, they can run scanners, they can do all kinds of things. So in many of those cases, we just see clients that just have no EDR or XDR type solution. Patch management. While we do oftentimes see time periods or time lags between the announcement of a vulnerability and when it's patched, for the most part, the patches come out in a relatively reasonable rate. They come out, pretty quickly, depending on their criticality. But if you don't have a patch management program that's staying on top of all of this stuff, those things can be easily exploited. And there are even victims that we've seen where, patches were available for certain exploits, let's say proxy shell, for a year, and the victim still had not patched their exchange. So we see this a lot. Brute force mitigation, we talked about the RDP, but this also applies to things like SQL management that can be accessed from the outside, being brute forced, and other types of accesses that are just user and password related for authentication. Security alerts, we see a lot of fatigue. Even though we may have EDR or XDR in our environment, I actually have an APT engagement right now where we saw a lot of activity in their endpoint protection that should have perked up some ears and rung some bells, because the threat actor was using tools that they should not have been using, but the client was never paying attention. If you're seeing Mimikatz, for instance, being run in your environment, it shouldn't be the attitude that, hey, our tool stopped it. No, we're good to go. We're all set. No, that's not really how you need to be thinking. How you need to be thinking is, how did that get executed in the first place? Who is on that system that is attempting to run Mimikatz, right, to attempt credential theft? You kind of have to take that a little bit further and don't put your head in sand saying, oh, there's probably nothing going on here because, our endpoint blocked it. You need to look one level deeper and say, how did this actually happen? We need to investigate what's going on, because if this got stopped, what didn't get stopped, right? What living off the land type things can be going on here that we didn't stop or didn't see? Password security. This one also goes back to brute force mitigation. It's kind of the same hand-in-hand thing. Weak passwords are easy to guess. So, have some difficult passwords if you can. Have a certain number of character sets and certain types of characters that are be required. And then, of course, misconfigurations. If software is misconfigured right, if your EDR, XDR solution is misconfigured not to stop certain things, well, it's obviously not going to stop them. So that is all I have today. Do we have any questions from anybody?
Well, first I want to thank you, because that was an amazing presentation, and I appreciate that. Can you go back to the previous slide? This is Mark Levine, the Deputy Director of NISA.
Sure.
Can you go? Okay. So one of the questions that did come in is for our non-technical audience who has to devote resources to strengthen their cybersecurity posture, what are the top 3 things that a county or a local government can do to add the most protection to their systems?
Well, again, there really is not a list of top 10 things, right? The defense in depth concept is important because it is a layered approach, right? There's not going to be 3 things. There's a whole slew of things. And I would say the first thing to have is that person who understands that, right? You need to have someone who's, a CISO who has the experience and the knowledge, has, CISSP, to understand all of these different layers and deal with each one of these different layers. So it's really not, you really can't pick 3 things and say, hey, these are the 3 things that are the top or the best, right? There are some no-brainers, obviously, and these are actually some of those no-brainers. But there really isn't just a, hey, we do these 3 and these are going to be our best bang for our buck. One of the most important things, in my opinion, is probably the EDR or XDR. And don't get something that is just like an antivirus, McAfee or Symantec or something like that. You need to have a legit EDR, XDR tool. Something like Cortex XDR or something like that, that has the ability to do much more in-depth examination of the information that is coming across that endpoint and allows you to actually respond to it. If you see something occurring, you need to be able to isolate that system in the state it's in. Don't allow threat actor access. You're essentially killing his access, and then allowing you to investigate what happened here and how did it happen and where did this activity come from, and start tracing back and figuring out where this threat actor came from. There really is no 3 things, but that is one of my more important things. Visibility on your endpoint, visibility on your network. Good firewall. Make sure that you're keeping logs so that in case something happens, there are oftentimes when we have an attack, and we'll go to the client and say, okay, well, we need firewall logs for these dates from this system. Well, we don't have firewall logs. They only go back 5 days or something like that. Well, you need to make sure that you have that visibility. Make sure that you test all your firewalls. Make sure that that those logs exist and you know how long they exist for. Make sure you know where all your critical data is and you have protections for that critical data, because that is one of the things the threat actors are going to go for, is that critical data. That is like the fly to the honey type thing. That's one of the first places they're going to go, is where your file servers are. And it's pretty easy to figure out where file servers are, because they're often called file server or file 01 or whatever. As humans, we tend to call them easy things that we understand and we can find quickly and easily, but that also helps the threat actor understand what's important in your environment too, by just seeing the host name and not having to actually do any interrogation of that system.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. I want to remind everybody on the line right now, now's a chance. You have an expert in the field who's done this for decades and is currently doing this across the breaches and breaches across the country. So this is a great chance for you to ask a question. If you have one, please submit it to your questions panel on your webinar dashboard. So if you get into a system and you're doing forensics, and you're John, and you're starting to look at what happened, are you able to identify you talked earlier about the groups that are doing this? Are you able to identify the individuals? Are there prosecutions that happen in the data breaches or ransomware cases?
Well, there are some prosecutions, but they're obviously not, every day. These threat actors are often in locations that can be shielded. There's a lot of threat actors in Russia and Belarus, in Ukraine, and just recently, in the last year, we've had opportunities to grab some of those Ukrainian threat actors because of political pressure, and our reach has extended a little bit more because we're helping Ukraine and so forth. The regime in Russia could very well change in the next year, and it could be a political environment where they start assisting us. Right now Russia's in financial and political turmoil, and the longer the things draw out in Ukraine, it could get worse. And things could change in our favor at some point where the regime is overthrown and we get a favorable regime who is trying to bring Russia back into the world fold. And we could actually get access to some of these threat actors that we've not only identified, but have warrants in some cases for. There are also been circumstances where some of these threat actors are in other countries, and we've been able to work cases. The Lapsus group that I've actually talked about, we arrested just recently with law enforcement arrested with the help of Palo Alto Networks. We provided a bunch of intelligence on the Lapsus threat group, and they identified one of them in Britain and several of them in Brazil, and they've actually taken steps to arrest those guys. So there are opportunities to get these guys. They are somewhat limited, because of what country they're in and so forth. But in the end, the threat actors aren't as anonymous as they like to think they are. We do have run into opportunities to identify the individuals. Usually it's in conjunction with law enforcement, because they have additional powers that in the private sector we don't have. But yes, in short, we do have opportunities to arrest some of these guys.
Great, thanks. So there's been a breach, a ransomware, or an incident that's happened, and they call you in. How long does it take for you to identify what happened, when, and how detailed can you get?
So it's kind of like one of the answers I always say in forensics is it depends. It depends on what data is left behind. If a threat actor is going through the environment and he's doing things and then he starts deleting logs or deleting things and cleaning up his tracks, it's a little bit more limited and it's a little bit more difficult to determine what's going on and what he's doing. But it also depends on the visibility you have. If you had no EDR, XDR solution that was logging those types of actions, well, you may not see anything, or you may see minimal things going on. You'll have a basic understanding, but not a detailed understanding of what the threat actor was doing. So every situation is a little bit different, and that's why I said, have the best visibility you can in your environment, because there are going to be times, when you may be attacked, and you're going to want to have those answers. You're going to want to understand, okay, yes, we got attacked. There's nothing we can do about that. We already got attacked. But how do we avert this in the future? We have to understand, how did they get into our environment? What did they do while they were in our environment? And those lessons learned, can sometimes be minimized if you don't have the visibility that you need. If you don't know what occurred on those endpoints, if you don't know how they got into the environment initially, well, how are you going to stop that in the future? So make sure that you do have the visibility, not only on your network, but also on your endpoints.
So we're encouraging our counties and local government leaders to champion tabletop exercises locally. Where does this fit into a tabletop exercise?
Yeah, so tabletops are really helpful. And the reason is, most companies and most groups, an attack doesn't happen every day. So you don't get a lot of time to, this would be like an NFL team just coming together in the preseason and getting together and having dinner and then going in and having, the first game, on Monday. Okay, well, let's just go play. Well, we haven't practiced. We don't know the playbook. You're the center. What is your job? Well, I'm the wide receiver. Where do I line up? Things like that. You have to understand what your role is during these. So the tabletops are a very good exercise in understanding, okay, we're going to jump through this thing. Yes, it's going to be faux. It's not going to be real, but you start to identify things where where you're lacking. You start to say, okay, you know what? We didn't bring legal in and we really could have used them for this reason. Or our communication wasn't very good with this team. Let's make that better the next time we do this, right? So you start to see where your deficiencies are, and then when you're much better prepared when an actual attack happened, because you've already been through it a couple of times, and you may still run into problems when that actual attack happens. And it's a constant learning process. You're constantly learning. But you get better every time you run through it, and those practices or those tabletops are a big part of that. This important learning process.
There are some people out there that say it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. So when you're doing a tabletop or you're strengthening your posture, do you identify an incident response consultant ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good practice. You know, when you call me, let's say you get hacked tomorrow and you call me. Well, there are going to be certain legal requirements that are going to have to be handled, right? We have to sign a contract. We have to give you an estimate of what we think needs to be done. Your legal is going to want to look over those contracts and the master services agreement, and they're going to want to, potentially make changes. And sometimes things can get bogged down, and those issues can, you lose time. Let's say it takes a day or two just to get through the legal issues before we can actually get engaged. That's a day or two that we've lost, right? Or provided more access to the threat actor during those 2 days. Um, if let's say you bought a retainer with us or something similar to that, all of that paperwork is done in advance, right? So all we need to do is get access to your environment. Let's say you have Cortex XDR in your environment. All you need to do is create us an account and we can start running right off the bat. So all of those, time gaps can be a detriment to your investigation. So it definitely is an advantage if you have those taken care of beforehand.
Okay, great. We've got several people on the line now. If any of them want more information, do you have a way for them to reach out to get more information from you or your team?
Yeah, sure. Actually, you can ping me or the Stephen Kane, and I believe that you guys have our email addresses. You can also go to our site. We have Palo Alto Networks.com has a a link to incident response services. Or if you're a Palo Alto customer already with let's say you have our firewalls or something like that, your representative can also get in touch with us relatively quickly.
Great. To tie things up, I want to put it back to you for a minute or two. Are there questions that one of our panel or one of our are there questions you expected that didn't get that you want to take up before we tie up this webinar? That was for you, John. One more minute to bring things to a close.
Nothing I can think of. Yeah, nothing I can think of, right off.
Okay, great. I want to thank you. Thank you for what you do to help protect the business and environments of our governments and of our businesses across the country. And thank you for your time today and your expertise, your ongoing expertise. I want to remind our audience to go to the NISAC.org website and either search a cyber or nisac.org/cyber for to watch a recording of this webinar or any of the other webinars in our cybersecurity webinar series. Thank you very much and have a great day.